Bill, before Bearstone existed, you spent years on the inside of a major enterprise as head of telecommunications at Simon Property Group. For people who don't know Simon, can you set the scene and tell us a bit about what the day-to-day looked like?
Sure, Tim. Simon, for those who don't know, they're the largest mall developer in the country, and through my first 20 years there, they went through several acquisitions and grew their portfolio to over 400 locations at one point. And it was made up of outlet centers and covered malls. And so, to provide services to each of those locations, one of my jobs was to get services, connectivity, voice and data services to each of those properties and then transition all of those to be able to work with Simon applications so that the mall staff could perform their daily task.
With 400 locations, I'm sure you have a lot of services there, and telecom spend was significant. What was the process for managing the carriers and that spend?
Yeah, for the first several years, we were mostly just signing renewals with our large carriers. So it was a contract that was already in force. So we were just doing amendments and maybe changing some rates or adding a new type of service, such as an MPLS or VoIP or POTS replacements and things such as that. And then one of the first things I noticed was that carrier bills were starting to vary month to month. To being from flat to being more varied. And when I started to dig into the invoice detail, I was finding there was one-time fees, special service fees were added, and some services were just at the wrong rate. But for the most part, they were also smaller amounts. So I didn't really dispute them or didn't deal with them with the carriers that much.
When you started digging in on those, what was actually happening inside of the invoices?
Well, I remember getting into an invoice that was normally about a $40,000 a month, and it grew to $55,000 one month. And obviously that caught my attention. And it didn't take long to look at when I was going through it to find that the carrier in this case just made an error when inputting the rate for that service and overcharged every single site on that bill. And that was that was quick to identify, and I called our account rep, and it was fixed on the net by the next month's bill. But it made me aware that, hey, there are definitely things going on. And I think that was just basically a human error. Somebody had just done the wrong thing.
Here's a question that people might be afraid to ask. When you surfaced billing errors to your carriers, what was their response? And did they push back or did they readily fix them?
For the most part, I, the account reps weren't really aware of the errors. I had to make them aware of them. And when I did, they weren't surprised. They didn't push back, but they did as much as they could to try to get it resolved. But that also wasn't what they were being compensated on. So it wasn't their job to do that, but that was the relationship that I had and that they had with their customers. So that was my only choice to deal with. So they did what they could, but yeah, many times it was not enough.
Well, after what you saw at Simon, how did your view of the carrier enterprise relationship change? From the outside, most people assume carriers are just billing what they're owed and everything should be peachy. But what changed in your view?
Well, I don't know if there was a real change. I generally got along well with all my account reps, so they tried to help when possible, but they acknowledged that the errors were there because other their customers were complaining at it as well. So, but I generally tried to keep the relationship positive where we could.
I'm also kind of curious, Bill, at what point did your thinking go from this is a problem I'm solving for Simon to this is a problem everybody has and nobody's solving it correctly?
Well, as time went on, the errors we saw were getting pretty consistent, and it was across all of the carriers, not just some.
Mhm.
But we did notice that the carriers that we had the largest spend with, the more the spend, the more complex the bills, the more the errors. And So I spent a lot of time going more through those than the smaller amounts, but um, one excuse that I heard that popped up more often than not is they would blame it on acquisitions. My
Mm.
account rep would say, "Well, we just acquired another company, and those billing systems haven't really been combined yet." And I did hear that a lot, but after a while, it was, maybe 5 or 6 years after the acquisition, and we're still having those kinds of errors. So it kind of made me suspicious that they could do something about it, but they generally weren't.
So why don't you bring us to Bearstone? When you founded
Okay.
Bearstone, what was the core thesis?
Well, I really wanted to build something that would provide enterprise customers with an easy way to identify and dispute billing errors, which is exactly what I wanted during my time at Simon, but it just didn't exist. So I set out to identify how can I do this and do it efficiently and timely, knowing that most of those folks that were sitting in my chair just didn't have the time to actually go over all of that stuff. So that was the core purpose of building the BearGuard application.
One of the things that I've noticed in talking to you is that you use the term vendor governance rather than telecom expense management. Maybe talk to me a little bit about what's the difference and why it matters.
Yes, that part is very important. And a lot of folks think of telecom expense management and they think it's just managing all of your expenses. And there's a lot more to that. There is governance initially that's involved around negotiating contracts and getting the terms right and before you sign the contract. And they're involving engineering resources, IT management resources, your IT executive branch, and then eventually legal resources. So and most folks are very familiar with that kind of governance. But then there's governance that's surrounding the invoice processing service. Who receives it? Who approves it? What are they looking at to validate it and not audit it, to validate that that rate is correct and it matches what was signed, 2 or 3 years ago, and that the location is correct as well, and taxes and fees. So there's a whole lot of what I call vendor management, invoice processing governance that is missed in many organizations. So that's the big difference.
So why do enterprise IT and finance teams continue to have challenges? Why is this an ongoing topic of discussion?
What it seems is that we find that, well, basically, IT organizations today are just all being asked to do more with less. So they end up relying on somebody in AP or somebody that's been recently put in charge of telecom expense that doesn't really understand it as well. And they don't have the time. So they're all being asked to say, look at this and approve these. And another big reason, to be honest with you, is I found a lot of CIOs don't really believe that IT invoice processing for telecom is a problem. They
Mm.
don't, no one's going after them and saying, hey, you're paying too much. They're just not aware of it. So if they're not aware of it, they're not looking to solve that problem. So it's somewhat of a challenge to make sure that they're aware that these errors occur and they occur month after month.